Hi, my name is James Whitlow Delano, founder of Everyday Climate Change on Instagram, and welcome to Everyday Climate Change Interviews. I talk to artists, photographers, and activists about their work on behalf of the environment. Today, I'd like to introduce Ashley Crowther, who will share his book project, Our Dark Materials. I actually had the pleasure and privilege of writing the preface to the book. Ashley and I met through Instagram, actually. I was taken by his work on restoration of the mangroves in the South Pacific, and we soon discovered how much we have in common. Ashley's based in Seoul, I'm based in Tokyo, and the cultures are quite similar. We go back and forth talking about that. His mother is actually Korean, and my wife is Japanese Korean, so we share those common threads as well. His book on black carbon talks about how climate change is kind of supercharged by the black carbon and how it affects the ice pack above the Zanskar Valley as well, meaning less water for the people who live there. Without further ado, I'll just hand it over to Ashley and let him share this amazing project with you. So Ashley, thanks so much for joining us. This is an amazing project, and as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm proud to have written the preface. This is the book, Our Dark Matters, beautifully produced. I'll share some video of it later. The amount of work that went into this, the printing, everything is deeply thought out. And so what I'm going to do is allow you to share a screen and talk about the project. So I'm going to let it go and look forward to hearing more about the photographs.
Sure, thank you, James. Yeah, it was as you know, producing a book is a beast of its own. So it was a long work in progress, but yeah, it means a lot. So I'm just going to give a little kind of brief tour of some of the, I guess, the main images in the book that I feel like represent the work as a whole and represent the project. So for everyone that doesn't know, this is these collection of images are taken from my book, and I guess they, in my eyes, they represent, I guess, the vast majority of what the actual project was about and the issue itself. So Our Dark Materials is based on black carbon and its impacts on the Himalayas. So for those who aren't familiar with black carbon, it's the tiny particulate matter that comes from smoke. And this is having a range of impacts on Himalayan glaciers, which provide water for billions of people across Asia. And then on top of that, you have black carbon, which also impacts people's health as well. So the project kind of tried to tackle this entire kind of, I guess, a circular problem, so to speak. And I first read about this issue in a book by author Jonathan Mingle, who documented this back in, I think it was it would have been early 2010s. And I figured it wasn't really getting that much attention, and it kind of drove my curiosity to kind of go see what's happening up there. I mean, I had always been cognizant about climate change in the Himalayas, but this was kind of a different side of things where I was like, well, this is a big issue, and it's not really getting talked about too much, because I feel like black carbon is more of this kind of niche issue that with climate change that compounds climate change's impacts. So there was one village up in the Zanskar Himalayas called Kumik at about 3,500 meters above sea level. This is in the northern Indian Himalayan region. And they had watched so I had heard before I went there, they had watched their glacier that was behind their village completely disappear over the past couple of decades, 3 or 4 decades. So this kind of speed, this was happening in, I guess, real time and in our lifetimes, and it was having real impacts now. So I went up there, and this image in particular was one of the first that I took when I got up there. So this is actually what was a water storage pool. So this is where the canal from the glacier kind of leads the water down into this storage pool. So they store it up so they can use it into their fields where they're growing their crops. And I got up there and I just saw this, and it just kind of represented just how dry things were. I mean, there was such little water coming from this now completely retreated glacier. So most of this water that was coming through the canal was actually from a couple of underground springs that were recharged by snow melt. So the glacier is not actually providing this water itself, but like it used to in the past. And I guess I saw this kind of scene play out, and it's just this. You think of the Himalayas, this idyllic landscape, right? It's just this incredible, powerful place. But then there's this underlying crisis that's slowly growing and growing. And I shouldn't say slowly, it's here now. It's happening now. And the water across the region it's not only just this village, it's everywhere. People are having huge problems. And I think this image for me really personified everything, because it was just one of those really stark, in-your-face kind of situations where what you were thinking about presented itself in real life. So this next one is it's from the same village in Kumik, of a little girl just walking back to the village with a couple of jerry cans full of water. And this is kind of like a daily thing for everyone. The women and children are always the ones that are going out collecting the water. And for me, seeing this happen, it was one of those very kind of lonely moments where I felt like there's this tiny pocket in the world where people don't really know about, where a lot of suffering's happening because of things that we take for granted, especially in the developed world, where water is just this given source where we turn on the tap. And when I saw this happening, it just kind of, it felt for me, it was quite emotional when I took this, recalling back now. I just saw her carrying this water back, and I feel like for me, the two little jerry cans represent the entire situation itself, where there's just this, it's representative of how much water is left, and there's really not much. And so this third one here is of Tenzin, Tenzin Chezin. So she's with her children. And this was not in the same village that in Kumik, where I was before. This was actually in Lower Kumik, is what they were calling it. So the water situation got so bad that people were forced, or well, not forced, but deciding to migrate down towards closer to the Zanskar River, which is the main river that kind of flows through the valley. So Tenzin was one of the first families to move down to this plot of land called Lower Kumik now. And about 3 or 4 years before I took this picture, they had built a canal to bring water up from the Zanskar River, but then that got washed away by a glacial flood outbreak upriver. So now Lower Kumik as well was suffering water shortages, and they were relying on the water that's coming from the top village coming down again. So they had put a lot of they put their life savings into building a new house and hoping that things would get better, but they were just facing the same exact problems that they were trying to escape in the first place. And I went down there. I spent a couple of days down there, and it's just this. Well, now this is barren landscape, just windswept and dry. It's like the moon, and I felt like this little. This portrait itself was quite cute. The kids ran outside, and there's this little patch of garden they had there, and I guess, despite the circumstances, there's still so much, I guess, positivity within the community, and there's a lot of solidarity within the community, and I felt so welcomed there, despite the circumstances of what I was photographing. And I think the two little kids ran outside when their mum was standing there by the flowers. She was tending to the garden before I took this, and they were just kind of very curious to see me there.
Yeah, it's a sweet moment. Just a little injection too is that you notice in the background. So you're at what, 3,200 meters, maybe?
35.
3,500
Yeah.
meters. So you're at 3,500 meters. I don't know. That'd be about 12,000 feet in the English system. And you'll notice that in Central Asia, some places in the Andes, you don't have any forest. If you go to the Rocky Mountains in North America, you can go from desert to the mountains and you'll have a forest. So this just shows how dry and marginal it is there to begin with. And also, if you're on the south side of the Himalaya, you do have wet. The mountains shut out the moisture. So as you can see, the rain is not extending past those slopes behind you. So this is such a difficult place to survive in the best of times. So I think this photo really points that out so well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely in the rain shadow. So basically the mountains, they just block all the rain. And I mean, there are some areas, I'm not sure of the exact figure, but it's a tiny, tiny bit of rainfall every year. It is dismal compared to, say, the other side of the mountains where the rain actually falls. So most of the water here and for a lot of these regions in rain shadows, they're all completely reliant on ice and stored water that has come down or formed over millions of years, and then the rivers come down too. So it is such a tough place to live, but people, they have adapted and they've thrived in these areas. But right now I feel like the changes are occurring so fast that it's becoming difficult to adapt without having to make really drastic decisions, like moving your house. I mean, that is something that I myself can't fathom doing. It is such a huge thing to think about. It's like, hey, we got to move to go get closer to water, and that is some serious decision making and some issues going on right now. So this next image is of Tashi Stobdan. So this is going back up into the main village of Kumik. So Tashi is actually a good friend of mine now. He's the first person I met when I went up there the first time, and he's the first person to kind of welcome me into the village and show me around, and gave me a room in his house. And I spent a lot of time photographing Tashi and his wife. So this was in, again, 2016 in the summertime. So what Tashi's doing right now is they're gathering all the fodder for the animals. So they're going to store this and then this would be the feed for the animals that kind of takes them through the winter. So, but the problem that they're having a lot of the time now is that, so this is all leftover crop material, right? From I think they're growing peas, so green peas as a cash crop. So a lot of the crop materials now is because there's not enough water, they're not able to grow as much. So then in turn, the fodder is actually it's getting reduced. So before I was there, about 3 years ago, I think, they were telling me about how one year it was particularly bad, and they had to sell off a lot of livestock for a very, very, small sum. And this is a huge problem up there because livestock are, as you know, James, like they're so integral to people's livelihoods in many rural areas. They provide you milk. In this case, in here, they even produce their own yogurt. They produce wool. Cows produce dung, which is used as fuel, things like that. So livestock they're really one in the same with people's lives. So to hear that they had to sell at such a small sum was hard, because you can only imagine what kind of devastating effect that would have had on the village. And this one here is a panorama of from Kumik, of kind of a similar scene where they're drying the fodder out in the sun. And this one here, you can really see how dry things are, except these little pockets of greenery that you get from these really small but important water sources around the villages in the region. And one of the starkest things for me here is actually the mountain range in the background. So those mountains that you see in the background, they're close to 7,000 meters, and almost all the ice is disappeared. There's still some left, but if you talk to people, and a friend of mine who lives in Padum, which is a town off in the distance, kind of below the big tall mountains over there, he told me that only 20 years ago that you could see the ice literally coming down to kind of midway point. And now this ice is fully retreating, and there's just very, very little left. And it really shows that it's not just one village experiencing this water problem, it's an entire region. And seeing the impact like that on such a macro scale, it's frightening, to be perfectly honest, considering how many people depend on this vital water source. And this one here, this is Tashi's wife, Zangmo. So Zangmo is here, so this is her basically putting all the fodder onto the roof for storage. And then there's also an underground thing. They've got this special container box in everyone's house where they put all of the fodder as well. But this is Zangmo. I remember walking up the stairs when I took this. It wasn't actually a set up portrait. It was her just standing up after she was bent over and fiddling, going through all the fodder. And then she stood up and she looked at me with this candid look, and it just turned into a moment where things just kind of worked, and the situation presented itself, so to speak, as opposed to asking her to stand there and pose. It was just a completely organic moment of her working. So this next one is it was taken late afternoon, as the livestock were coming home from the high grazing grounds. So each day, one of the villagers takes the goats and the sheep up to this high grazing ground, probably around anywhere between 4,000 meters plus. So they go up into these huge hills, and then they come back down during the day. And again, it just goes to show for me how integral livestock is to a rural village like this, where even every day in the afternoon, the kids used to come out and watch them all come back, and they all kind of roost into their own homes. Everyone has maybe 4 goats to themselves. Each house is probably about 3 or 4 goats. And this one here is actually where you can see, so this is actually the 3 women leading the cows up to the high grazing ground. So here actually is where you can actually finally see the glacier, or what is left of the glacier. So on the top there, you can see a little bit of ice that's come down, but you can see the scars of the glacier, where the glacier kind of came in the past. And you can see that moraine where it used to push. the ground. And now none of that ice melt actually comes down to the village. So the water source is completely gone from this glacier. It just does not flow anymore. So that's about 6,100 meters to the top of that mountain. And we took this picture at around 5,000 aroundish. But again, it just goes to show that how quickly this is happening. This is in a matter of decades that much ice has disappeared from an altitude of 5 to 6,000 meters, and that's how warm it's getting, right? I mean, you think of high mountains and you think of constant cold. You don't think that it should be getting that warm that quickly.
What would the temperature be on that day, for example?
So, summer in the Himalayas is beautiful and punishing, because during the day you'd get honestly maybe 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, but then at nighttime it would drop down to zero-ish or below zero. Like up there, it would definitely probably in the summertime maybe below minus 10 degrees Celsius at the top. But the scary thing is that it's on average, as everyone is very aware of now, that global temperatures are rising, and even this is hitting the highest point on Earth, in the Himalayas.
Yeah, and just through my own reading is that during the Ice Age, Asia was cold, but it was so dry and remains the Eurasian landmass to this day that it had no ice sheet. Even during the Ice Age, it was cold, but it didn't have. And likewise, as you said, 6,000 meters is roughly 20,000 feet, and you don't see any snow. And it's not for the lack of cold, but it just the rain clouds are shut out. So that's striking. May I ask you a question about the women leading? And you mentioned that each family has, say, for example, with the sheep, 4 head of sheep. So the village collectively takes care of the animals. They take turns bringing them to pasture.
Yeah.
So
that was one of the. I guess it was a preview into how communal and how community solidarity depends and keeps things moving in these regions. So I remember the night before I took this picture, I was at Tashi's house, and he told me that Zangmo, his wife, it was her turn to go up there. So they rotate. And so we woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I followed Zangmo up the hill. I didn't know, they didn't tell me where I was going. They just said, oh, they go up the hill. That was my description, right? Little did I know it was like a 1,500 meter uphill trek. And here I am, walking behind Zangmo, who's just a trooper, just going up there with no stops. And I'm going, oh my God, trying to keep up myself. So yeah, they rotate and they take turns. So the women in particular have the duty of looking after all of the animals and making sure that they collect all the dung for fuel, and they also get taken to the higher grazing grounds, as we can see here. So speaking of dung, this is taken. It's what they call a doxa, which is, I think Kumik in Zanskar is one of the only villages left that have a doxa. Not many really have this anymore, where the cows kind of come together and where they collect all the dung. So here you can see that all the dung is it's kind of made into a patty, and then it's dried in the sun, and all of this is preparation for winter. So this is all their fuel, because there's, as you can see, there's no trees in this area, so wood is just not an option. And obviously there's no infrastructure for gas heating or electrical heating. So, and this is a free resource. This comes from their livestock, and this is another reason why, as I was mentioning, livestock are so important, because they provide fuel. It's fuel to cook, it's fuel to keep warm. But on the flip side of that coin is when you burn dung, it creates just an incredible amount of black carbon, which is then floating up and landing on the glaciers, and speeding up that melting. So just to go into that, kind of diverge a little bit, is as you know, glaciers are white, they're ice, and snow and glaciers reflect something like 80 to 90% of sunlight back into space. So that it's very good at not melting, so to speak. But as the black carbon's kind of getting deposited onto the white ice, because black carbon is black, as the name gives away, it's actually absorbing more heat from the sun. So what that does is it creates this positive feedback loop where once the melting starts, it just keeps going. So as you can imagine, dark colors absorb heat, light colors reflect heat. So it's doing the opposite. So it's speeding up the glacial melt. And then you have climate change's impacts on top of that. So it's kind of, again, like a compounding impact of warming. And so now we're moving down into India, where while the Himalayas have their own black carbon issues with their kind of localized burning, I think much of the smoke comes from the plains of India. So this can come from cities, it can come from coal mines, it can come from villages. And mind you, everyone should remember that there are 1.4 billion people in India, and that is an incredible amount of people. So and I think a big percentage, I'm not going to say the exact figure because I can't remember particularly, but a very, very significant percentage of people still rely on solid fuels to cook in India. And when you multiply that by hundreds of millions, that is an incredible amount of smoke, and in turn, an incredible amount of black carbon that's being produced and then subsequently floating up into the Himalayas, creating this gigantic problem in terms of melting glaciers and compounding the impacts of climate change. So in this image, this was taken in Jharia, in a coal mining region in India, in the state of Jharkhand. So Jharkhand have some of India's biggest coal reserves, and a lot of the mining there is all state run, but there's a lot of also illegal kind of scavenging. And this photo in particular was taken in a charcoal producing pit, where this is kind of scavenged coal and then it's burnt to produce charcoal. And I mean, you see kids running around in here, you see families working in here, and it is a really, really hellish place. And I remember this moment in particular. It's one of those images that stays with you for a long time after you take the pictures of. It kind of made me question a lot about my job as a documentary photographer. At the same time, as much as I didn't want to take this picture, I felt like I had to. I had a duty to kind of capture this moment in terms of, hey, this is happening. This is what we're dealing with, and this is kids. You know, this little girl is here, and she's waiting for her parents to finish work. So she's down there, you can imagine, for a significant amount of time. God only knows what kind of health impacts she's going to have as an infant, breathing in direct, basically direct coal emissions, which is not only just black carbon, but it's full of heavy metals like arsenic and lead. So it was a very confronting scene to photograph, and it definitely
It's a tough issue, isn't it? I mean, there is this brush fire running through our industry about consent versus non-consent. I, as you said, you're confronting reality, and it's uncomfortable to see it, but it's, in my opinion, necessary. I think that we're recording this during the time of the war in Ukraine, and there are profound volumes of photographs coming out of there that are very uncomfortable to see. Consent is not, you have consent to be there, by the way, that's not an issue here. But that's our job, is to photograph what is happening, because unless we see this, you can talk about this situation, but unless you see it with your own eyes, and you've documented it here powerfully, how do we affect change? One photograph sometimes can change the world. Sometimes it takes a collection of photographs over time for us to confront the reality of what's happening to our brothers and sisters around the world. So I've always been drawn to this photograph, and I'm aware of the pushback some people will give, but I think that this is an important photograph, that it really summarizes, and this is not an outlier. This is not an anomaly. I've walked along railroad tracks in India where people are living rough in huts, of bamboo and found grass. And it's not cherry picking. This is what's happening. India is becoming richer, and you're seeing less of it, in part, I believe, because of photographs like this. So anyway, I just figured I'd interject that point. So I think this is an important photograph on so many levels.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It as it goes for things like consent. It's like, I have consent to be there, but at the same time, it's one of those things where it's like, I can't not photograph this and not tell this story, because I think as a human being as well, I guess one of my kind of philosophical outlooks on life is to try and lessen the suffering of others, and lessen the suffering that the world has to go through. And I think that you have to tell this story. You can't not tell this story, and you can't just brush it under the rug as something that's happening somewhere else. It's like, obviously I'm in a very privileged position where I don't have to live under these circumstances, but for me it's about using that privilege to kind of try and better the world in a small way. By whether or not this photograph betters the world or not is a different matter, but at least I can kind of, it's not something that I lose sleep over, but it's definitely something where I feel like, okay, at least I'm contributing to some sort of greater conversation that hopefully will put us on the right path, so we don't have to see this happening. Not having to take this photo is like the goal, right? I don't, that for me is that's the goal. Is like, I don't want to take photographs of this. It'd be a wonderful world if I didn't have to photograph this. And just continuing with the coal mining, so a lot of the scavenging happens on the bottoms of the mine pits. So here you have this. It's a very interesting place, Jaria, and it's a very confronting, but also you see it's very grey and very black, as you can imagine a coal mining be, but you see this kind of very vibrant colors of the women wearing saris, and collecting coal, and it's a very contrasting environment. And I've never photographed a place it's quite like this. It is, people talk about India as a land of contrasts, and this certainly speaks volumes in terms of that. And a lot of this coal is then either, they pick it and they take it up the top. So they either take this into their own home to burn as fuel for cooking or heating, or they sell it on the black market to these kind of charcoal burning places for extremely cheap. And this is an example of using the coal as a fire source to cook food. And this is the kind of stuff where the health impacts of black carbon and of just using coal in general as a cooking source come into really stark visual perception, where you can just see this with your eyes. This is what children and women are dealing with more or less on an everyday basis in some parts of India. And this is a three per day kind of thing. This is a breakfast, lunch, and dinner thing, where you have this incredible amount of smoke that is being inhaled by women and children. I think there are some scary statistics on how big the health impacts are on women and children in particular that have to spend time around these kind of stoves and in these kind of environments. There's now research showing that children exposed to black carbon and just air pollution in general affect their cognitive learning abilities when they're older. I mean, and even if we take internal health problems aside, I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of people, suffering debilitating burns from accidents, and also you have to, and what doesn't really get talked about that much is the issue of how many years of healthy life get taken away from disability, right? So imagine you're a woman or a kid and you get this crazy burn across your arm. It takes away your arm, and how much time do you lose from not being able to use your arm properly for the rest of your life? I mean, that's a huge issue. This picture in particular, just to make sure I be clear, this was taken in central India, so this is not in the same area as the coal mines, but as you know, the coal gets transported all across India. And this is just an example of a coal train in a similar region in central India, where it stops through this particular community, and they actually break in to the carriage to then scavenge the coal, which gets used to cook their food with. So this girl here, all the kids go in because they're much smaller than the adults. So it's a pretty crazy scene when you see it with your own eyes. You see everyone's got these huge long sticks, and they bash the locks of the carriage, and it breaks open the door, and the kids jump in and they rush in before the train starts moving to grab as much coal as they can. So these coal trains are delivering coal to factories and to power plants, and then they go back to the mines to pick up more coal. So on the way back, they kind of have these little bits left, these kind of slim pickings on the bottom kind of stuff. But again, it's free fuel. And that comes back to a development issue, where it's not necessarily saying that, hey, black carbon's these people's fault. It's like, well, there's not really an alternative. They don't have access to gas. Gas is too expensive. They don't have access to electricity. Electricity is too expensive. So you've got to do what you've got to do to survive, right? This one here is taken on the other side of India in Mumbai. So this is just, I guess, this was taken in 2016. So I haven't been back to Mumbai since then. So I'm not sure if they've clamped down on a lot of this, but this is just open burning of rubbish. And open burning of rubbish contributes a huge amount of black carbon into the atmosphere, and obviously you have the carry-on health effects of that too. But this was taken in Mumbai, just outside of very, very central Mumbai, in outside Dharavi, a big kind of industrial area where a lot of recycling happens. But this back then anyway happened, not all across the city, but in pockets. And if you go around a lot of big cities in India, you do have open burning just of rubbish everywhere. And not only do you get black carbon from this, because there's a lot of plastic in here too, so you get all those nasties that are going up in the air from the plastic as well. And now just moving up into the Himalayan region. So this was taken in Nepal. This is in the foothills. So you have this is about 2,000 meters. So you have this kind of wonderful kind of divergence of like alpine scenery with subtropical kind of plants where it sort of intermingles in a way. And a lot of these regions are facing huge deforestation issues. So Nepal in particular I think it's one of the most heavily deforested countries in Asia. And a lot of this just gets used as firewood. So because there is no alternative again. And a lot of the firewood is just cut down from all these forests, these cloud forests that cover the lower Himalayan region, the foothills. And right here, they're cutting down a big old tree. I was walking past on the way I was on the way to the high alpine regions to see the glaciers and the impacts of warming up there, but this was just on the way. And this happens on a huge scale all across the mountains, where in some cases you have just bare mountains that used to be covered in trees that are now just completely just brown and grassy. And before this area, there's a part where you walk and you can see these stumps of trees just all along the hillsides where it's just been so cut down, and it makes it really difficult to walk through, because you see it and you can't help but ask, like, can this forest ever recover from this? And it's I mean, yeah, we can reforest things and we can do a lot of work on that, but it's hard to replace a new forest with an old forest. So again, here we have a lady, this is back in central India, who is in the kitchen just preparing chai. We went to visit this village, and they were kind enough to invite us in, and it's very customary to receive a big healthy bowl of chai in any village that you get invited to. So, but here you can see the black carbon and the soot on the walls, where it's just from years and years of burning. And again, this for me, it really kind of illustrates that the amount of black carbon that's getting produced, you just don't see it. You don't see it because it comes from individual households that don't have access to alternative fuels. And this next one is in Delhi. So this was from my most recent trip in India. This was before the pandemic in 2020. This was literally as the pandemic was kind of skyrocketing elsewhere in the world, but it wasn't really a concern at the time. But this is from a power plant in Delhi in an early winter's morning. And again, you have black carbon coming from power plants that don't scrub, that don't use technology to scrub out the emissions before they get released. So a lot of the power plants in India are still very old, so they don't actually scrub out much of the black carbon that's getting produced from them. So here you have just this plume coming out of this power plant. And this is, I guess, a macro of the impact of smoke. This was kind of what I wanted to show with this image here, this massive aerial of the Himalayas. So this is on a flight going from Leh in Ladakh back to Delhi, and you can see the valleys are just choked, full of smoke. And you picture the Himalayas as this pristine environment that has this beautiful, clean air. And most of the time in many areas it does, yes. But when you see it from the top, it's mind-boggling. You see how much smoke is getting produced, and the further you move down towards the plain of India, the thicker that smog gets, and you can't even see the ground. And you see the valleys just clogged full of smoke, and you're like, this is the macro impact of hundreds of millions, if not billions, of fires happening across the country. And then here, I wanted to get a close-up of the impact on the glaciers themselves. So you have all these. You have a village like Kumik, who's having water shortages because their glaciers fully retreated. Then you have the fires burning down in the plains of India, and then now you have all this black carbon kind of getting deposited onto the ice. And yes, climate change has a big impact on how much ice is retreating because of just average warming temperatures, but you have black carbon's impact compounding that because it's a dark particle and it's absorbing more heat from the sunlight. So the ice's ability to reflect sunlight is basically diminishing. So you have glaciers across the region that they're on life support, so to speak. They are almost gone. I mean, here you can see what once was a very big glacier, as you can see from the scars that come down into the land of where the moraine is. It used to come down quite a lot, and now it's gone. And you can see the glacier on the right hand has almost fully retreated. They're no longer connected. And I haven't been back through this area since 2016, so conventional wisdom would suggest that this is probably worse now. And then all these glaciers, again, it comes back to water. They all produce the rivers across Asia, not just India, but just across Asia. So you have China, you have Pakistan, you have Nepal, you have India, you have Bhutan, you have Myanmar, you have all of Southeast Asia, Laos, Thailand. All of those rivers originate in the ice, in the mountains. And here you can see this image in particular is from the Spiti Valley in India. This was at about 4,000 meters, I think. And this is the Spiti River kind of snaking through the valley. And while you can't see the ice on these mountains here, this river is basically a culmination of glaciers melting. And all the tributary rivers that come into it are a culmination of all the glaciers melting. And that gives life everywhere. I mean, and these areas are dry as it is, but that little bit of water that comes down enables life. And this is the Drung Drung Glacier. This is again in India. This is going towards Zanskar from the town of Kargil. And here, this is a very beautiful glacier. It's one of those really picturesque ones that you kind of imagine a glacier would look like. But when you look closely at this image, you can see how much thickness it's lost in terms of the volume of ice itself. You can see the scar lines on the mountain where the ice used to carve down, and now it's kind of lost. It's thinned out, so to speak, and then you can see it's melting very, very quickly at the edge. If I talk to my friend Ergain about this in Zanskar, he mentioned about 10 years ago they used to be able to ski on the edge of that glacier, and now you can't because it's all muddy and rocky. And just another one of a river. So this is of the Suru Valley, again on the way to Zanskar in India. So it really goes to show just how beautiful water can make things, right? In such a very barren, dry landscape, you have this lush greenery, and you have communities that are thriving because of these rivers. And the last one of the glaciers here this is in Nepal. Um, this is the Nozamgumpa Glacier. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly off the top of my head, but this is at 5,600 meters above sea level. And you can see here, which is the amazing thing about this, is it's so high, but you have so many melt pockets appearing on the glacier from it's just these ponds that are just melting over the summer, and that they're happening all down the glacier as far as you can go. And now we're moving back into going towards Kumik. So this image is part of my journey where I took in the winter time in the Himalayas in India what's called the Chadar. So you walk down the Zanskar River on the frozen Zanskar. You walk towards Zanskar on the frozen Zanskar River. It's the only way into Zanskar Valley in the wintertime. There's no roads and there's no planes. So this was the only way in. But I think there's a road that just got put in now that's open year round, I was told recently. So that's good news for the locals. But here you have this frozen river, and I'll go through this kind of a couple of sets of these. I met these two guys who were collecting driftwood to go burn in the cave for the overnight stay in the cave by the river. And here you can see another image of the frozen Zanskar River walking towards Zanskar. Now, the interesting thing about this journey was that the locals would tell me, and you could ask. I asked so many walking how much the actual walk has changed, and every single person said the ice is becoming more unstable. There's less predictability, and there's more warm days where you just shouldn't walk because it's just unsafe, because the ice could break. So, for example, this section here in this image is called, the area is called Wama. So that translates to roughly only a fox can cross. So it's a particular precarious area of the trip because there's no bank on the river. So if it does break, you're going to go under. There's not much to grab onto. And here, walking down to Zanskar was fine. It was very solid. It was very thick. We had no problems. But then on the way back, we got stuck in Zanskar after a snowstorm, and it got really warm at one point, and it completely destabilized the entire the river, and you couldn't walk along this because it was just basically not frozen. So we had to wait till it refroze. But here you can't see it, but the ice had dropped by about 2 meters when we were coming back. It was a completely different landscape to when we walked in. And then now we're back in Kumik. So I went back to Kumik after about 4 years of being there last. And I went back in the winter time just to see how things were going in Kumik, and they were not very good. The water was still bad. They were still facing water issues. But the thing about winter is that the winter is just brutal. There's only one spring that's not frozen. And the whole entire village of, I think, is about 250 to 300 people rely on this one spring for their water resources. And they have to make a trek up the mountain, basically about 1 kilometer up to get the water. And then they have to drag it back down in absolute freezing temperatures. Average temperature around here is like, probably during the day, like maybe minus 20 degrees Celsius. And then at nights it would drop down to minus 30. There's brutal conditions. And here you have a woman just breaking through the ice layer, trying to have a drink, because there's no water available for the livestock. They can't, because carrying down water for the livestock is another job that people have to do. So they're only carrying down water for themselves, and they have to bring the livestock up to kind of have a drink for themselves.
Wow. Just a quick note, a zo is a hybrid of a yak and a cow, right? Cattle. Yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure why they do that. Maybe it's just better meat for them.
Strength.
Strength. Uh-huh. Maybe, and maybe yaks are a little bit unruly by nature.
Yeah, yaks are unruly, and they're also they can get quite lazy apparently. So yeah. And here's the spring. So this is the one spring the entire village relies on during winter, and this is so you have two guys that were kind of going into the spring to see if it was still flowing and that everything was working okay. And you have people collecting the water. There's no tap. You can't just turn on the tap. You've got to go in there and hand dig, so to speak, the water out of the spring and put it into a jerry can. And then dragging the water back was kind of like a daily occurrence. All the kids got involved when it got to a point where it was, flat enough for them to pull it. And it was a repetition every day where the collection of water was like a pilgrimage almost for people, a necessary job to do every day, because you can only carry down and store so much water, right? This image here is down in Lower Kumik. So here, this is Tenzin. She's waiting for the emergency water tanker provided by the Indian government that provides water during winter to people and communities who are having water issues. So the tanker uses a diesel generator to pump water from a river that's not partly frozen, but not fully frozen. And then it pumps it into the tank, and then it brings it down, and then it provides the village or households with emergency water supplies for very, very cheap. So it's subsidized by the government. And this one's just in the kitchen. So again, like bringing this back to water again, I mean, water is integral to, it plays a part in so much. It's not just drinking and survival. It plays a part in culture. It plays a part in how food is prepared and how tea is prepared here in this case. So this is a very famous Himalayan brew of butter tea, which is putting the butter that's produced by the cows that they have into the big pot, and they just mash it in there with a bunch of salt, and it's just this big, very salty brew of calories that you need in wintertime. This portrait here is of siblings. So this is Rigzing Fonsuk, this is Rigzin Thandup Lamo, and Rigzing Yangdol. So these were some of the oldest people in Kumik. So I went and had a chat with them, and I just wanted to get their kind of view on history of the village and how much has changed over the course of their lives. And in the middle there you have Thandup Lamo. She's 78, if I remember correctly. And she was telling me how when she was a kid, she'd been there her whole life. When she was a kid, she could see the ice kind of coming down the mountain towards the village. There was never had water problems. They always got significant amounts of snow every year that would also recharge the springs as well. And I remember when I was sitting with them, on your left-hand side, their brother, Rigzing Fonsuk, he told me to look out the window, and he said, "Do you think that's a lot of snow outside?" And to me, I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of snow outside there. And he's like, nah, that's nothing compared to when we were kids. He said it's about half of what they used to get. And here we have the same where the spring is. This is when they connected a pipe to the spring, and a blizzard kind of came along. And I stayed up there. I hung around there for a bit just to I saw one other man walking up there, and it was a very lonely image for me. It speaks a lot of speaks to me in the way where sometimes I felt like the village in Kumik was alone in terms of their fight against this kind of losing battle against climate change and against like black carbon's impacts on the Himalayas. It's like you can't, one village can't, even if one village changes their ways, they stop burning or they get gas, it doesn't stop the impacts from happening that have already kind of started and are now kind of keep on rolling on. And kind of connects to this next image. I actually ended the book with this image. There's this little mural in the center of the village: "Save water, water is valuable." And it speaks volumes to me because it being in their shoes, if you put yourself in their shoes, for example, you begin to realize that water is the most precious resource, and without it we would simply not be able to do anything for that matter, and we do take it for granted, and we shouldn't. It really is this thing that I think now we're starting to see across the world, this big problem that's kind of rearing its head to do with water. And a lot of people are going through water shortages now. It's not just one village, but I think the village really is emblematic of the entire situation that the globe is going through. I mean, you have sub-Saharan Africa that's going through drought. You have even parts of the Amazon that are going through drought. You have the Americas in general. Everywhere. It's scary to think what would happen when you consider water on a civilization scale.
Yeah. I mean, this is a real tour de force. What I love about this project is it operates on that level, on the environmental level, but also shows your deep connection to this community and to the subject. I mean, just to emphasize one more time about what the Himalaya, the water tower of Asia, just if you do a ring around the Himalaya, you've got the Indus, the Ganga River, the Brahmaputra, the Salween, the Irrawaddy River, the Mekong, Yellow River, Yangtze River, all coming from that one place that is drying out. So this is hugely, and then you point out, the black carbon. India is kind of taking over that horrible place of it's a good place because they're becoming richer and more people are living better, but it's assuming that mantle of number one in the world of air pollution from China, and they're increasing their coal use until they can develop alternative renewable energy sources, and that's going to take time. So I also think that this series and book are both it's timely, both at the same time, to where India is at right now. And just for those who don't know, Zanskar is part of India. It's a Tibet majority area. I guess they're a minority within the Tibetan diaspora. But this is the entire book is made within India and Nepal, south of, well, I guess Zanskar is north of the Himalaya, but south,
Yeah.
or in the middle of it.
In the middle.
Yeah. So, I mean, so I did want to ask you a couple of questions about, your method. I mean, I noticed that maybe you can speak to what you did. For example, you were always looking to add to this project, Black Carbon. So I noticed, for example, you mentioned that you were invited to tea, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, look at the stains on that whitewashed wall from the carbon. Can you speak to how that process worked for you? A long-term project, maybe you weren't exactly thinking about black carbon at the time, but you thought to add to it as you traveled doing other things.
Yeah, it's a good question, James. It was one of those, and I think you would probably understand this yourself as well, but it was one of those projects where it snowballed, from one thing led to another, right? And when I first went to Kumik in the Himalayas, I never went there with the intention of doing a book or doing a monstrous project on black carbon. It was my pure interest just on the water itself and the water situation there. And when I went there and I saw how big of an issue this had become, I just kind of got a bit obsessive, and the connections kept getting made. And so then it, as I said before, it snowballed into this thing where I was like, well, there's a bigger story here. It's not just the water situation that the village is facing. It's how it connects to everything else that's happening in India as well in regards to black carbon. And I think one way that I tried to tell that particular story and make those connections was, in the book I split it into chapters. So I had it's kind of like a chronological journey of also how I took this path as well. So, but I felt like that told the entire story. I try to create this circular story where everything is connected in what we do. So I started with the village in Kumik having the water issues, and then I moved into the fire that's happening and all the fires that are happening on the plains of India. And then I moved it to the glaciers and the impact that the fire is having on the glaciers. And then in turn went back to the village in the winter time to kind of create this cyclic story where all these cause and effect issues have sources and endpoints, and then it goes around and around and around and again. So in a sense, what I was photographing everywhere, I had a million ideas in my head, but anything that was kind of representative of the smoke and the water and those connections, I would photograph in terms of, and that would involve a lot of traveling, God, like a lot of traveling when I think back on it now, and obviously not everything worked, from a pure creative standpoint and a photographic standpoint. But I tried to basically look at everything that smoke had a relationship with, and that everything water had a relationship with, and then how those two things came together to have this cause and effect impact.
Brilliant. And so you visited Zanskar the first time in 2016. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And so was that when it dawned on you? Did you went there? You met people, began speaking, and they were discussing the problem? Because a lot of people can just go and see the spectacular scenery and never notice the crisis at all unless you start talking to people. How did that happen for you?
I think the seeds were definitely sown many, many years beforehand. So I had always had a personal interest in the Himalayas since I was like 17. I went up to Mount Everest when I was 18, I think. It was the first time I went up there, and it just blew me away. I don't think I could come up with better words than that. It's just that simple. And just from a pure beauty perspective, back then in my earlier years, I was just kind of mesmerized by this landscape and the people that inhabited the landscape. It was just so special, and it made a very profound impact on my life. And then as time went by, I kept going back. I kept revisiting, going to new areas in the Himalayas, across India, Nepal, and in China too. And then as my interest grew, I started to read more about the impacts of climate change and what was happening up there. But The black carbon stuff didn't really start until around 2015 when I started reading about that. And I had always been aware that climate change was going to have a big impact on the Himalayas and in turn on the water security of billions of people. But then when I kind of started writing about black carbon, I was like, hey, this is a big issue that is happening that's not really getting talked about, but it's also, on the flip side, an issue that can get solved very quickly, as opposed to climate change, which is going to require this societal-wide change, right? But black carbon is kind of like one of those issues where it's a low-hanging fruit. Once you fix it, it's done, it's gone, and you improve lives, you slow down the regional warming, and it honestly doesn't require that much of a change in terms of societal shifting.
Yeah, it's kind of like plastic that way. It's a problem that we see a solution. I should ask you one more question about Kumik, though, before we move on. I want to talk to you about your family history with travel, and we'll get to that later. But I was struck by there are no deep wells in the valley, so they can't afford to drill because that would be an interim solution to their problems.
I think the biggest issue facing drilling is getting the infrastructure up there, which would, number one, probably cost a lot, and the energy required to use a drill
and to bring up the water as well.
Yeah, and to bring up the water as well would cost just too much. I think because drilling a deep well would be probably a good way to tap into some deep water sources, but I think the logistics and the cost around that it's not really a pragmatic solution because of.
It also goes to governments as well. I mean, if Delhi decided, hey, we're going to put a deep well in at the top of the valley, and I'm not talking about top of the Kumik Valley, but that whole Zanskar Valley, they could use gravity to aqueducts to feed the whole valley.
No,
so
absolutely.
It's also perhaps a political thing as well. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, yeah. I mean, I just got back from Chile, much wealthier area, and they as well. I mean, they had wells, but not deep enough. And some people, their wells at 13 meters had dried out. Some could afford to drill to 60 meters, not enough water still, but they needed pumps to bring it up. And even in Chile, they couldn't afford, most people could not afford to run a pump to get the water up once they had it anyway. So it's crazy. So, I mean, amazing coincidence. I mean, we talked about this before. Your dad, Jeff Crowther, was one of the original Lonely Planet writers. And I think my book, Latin America on a Shoestring, my first backpacking project, was written at least in part by him. And so you've grown up on the road, but also, unlike me, I had no familial tie to Asia. Your mom's from Korea. She's born in Korea. So you've got more of a connection to Asia from the family than I do. Can you speak to how, relationship with your parents, your dad's passed recently, but how that influences who you are as a person? You're living in South Korea, not Australia. So this is, in my opinion, much more intimate to you, and you have more of an intimate understanding of what you're documenting.
Yeah, I think, growing up, it was always interesting because I was going around with my parents to a lot of different weird and wonderful places. And being a kid, I wasn't able to fully comprehend a lot of those places in terms of what it meant to me. But I think as time went by and as I matured a bit, I started to realize the consequences of growing up in that kind of environment. It really instilled a huge sense of curiosity in what I do. And I think Asia in particular always held this very big lure for me. Just to remind you of like a conversation I had with my parents when I was like 16 years old. I remember they asked me like, "What do you want to do when you finish high school?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't want to go to school again." And they were like, "Ah," and they said, "Oh, why don't you go to India?" My dad and mum were like, "Oh, go to India. Go spend some time in Asia and see the world a bit and learn from that." And my parents were always very pro, I guess, learning from doing rather than learning from reading. I mean, as
See, that's such a wonderful. I've always envied friends who come from families that don't seek normality. If I had said at 16 I wanted to see the world, which I did, they would have said basically, "You're going to die in a gutter in the street. Become an engineer, go to college, and get a real job." And it wasn't said in a mean-spirited way, but my parents' generation were raised in the Depression. So that's a wonderful validation of your aspiration to travel.
yeah, it kind of played off each other, the upbringing and then what I chose to do afterwards. So I think the going back to curiosity, I mean, if we relate it back to the project, our dark materials in the book, I mean, going up to Kumik, when I first went up there, I just decided to go up there. I had no contacts up there. I didn't know really what I was doing, had no sense of where I was going either, because that was while I had been to the Himalayas and across the region before, Zanskar was this completely new destination for me. I'd never been there, and I just decided to just get up and go do it one day. And after kind of succumbing to the urge, after trying to push it back up for a while, I said, "Okay, screw it, I'll just go do it." And I guess that really got instilled, I guess, from my history of being around and being lucky enough to have a family that kind of pushed for that to happen, as opposed to, don't go do something if you're not familiar with it, for example.
Exactly. Here's a question. I mean, so we're kind of in the prolonged pandemic becoming endemic. Borders are beginning to open, but post-pandemic, do you think what effect do you think the pandemic has had on your work? And for example, would you feel comfortable or any apprehension going back to a small isolated community like in Kumik?
I think the pandemic's been interesting. I mean, for me, photography itself has always been about travel. I've always related the two, and I'm one of those people who can't help but kind of argue against this whole idea of like photograph your backyard. For me, it doesn't quite give me the same sort of inspiration. I understand why people say that, and I get it, and I support people that do amazing work in their own backyard, for example. But for me as myself, I can't, I always associate work with and photographing with some sort of journey. To me, it's not just about making the pictures, it's about what you do to make those photos, about where you go and how you get there to make that image, and everything that entails, everything in between that. And I think the pandemic's been very hard on me because I haven't been able to move as I used to. So I haven't photographed that much in the past 2 years. I've photographed kind of just some small hikes and things like that, but it's very hard for me to find that creative kind of drive and that creative inspiration that I get from when I do go to a place that I have no idea about, or if I go to a place that's kind of has a journey from point A to point B, for example. that really gives me a lot of inspiration. And I think going back to the question is like, if will I be apprehensive about that coming into this next phase of life? I don't think I will, to be honest. I'm at the point where it doesn't affect me as much as it used to, because I know that, for example, I've done all that I can. I've gotten vaccinated. I can't really stop this big thing from happening. But I think that shouldn't stop us from how to stop us from living, and stop us from going around and kind of talking about the world. There's still stuff to do. We can't just drop our ambitions, and we can't just drop our passions, and we can't drop our interests. I think there's a lot of work to be done on multiple fronts. So for me, traveling, I can't wait to get back on the road and to find something to drive me.
Truly. I think we're kindred spirits that way. I mean, travel, we learn from people from Zanskar, or wherever you go, we're immersed in something different, and we're just like a sponge, learning every moment we're there, and it's a treasure. We're incredibly fortunate. Any ideas of the next project? Because this one is fantastic. Could be expanded upon in different directions. I mean, any ideas?
I think I want to take a step back from it. As important as it is, it really drove my life for the better part of 4 years, and it drove my creative ambition for the better part of 4 years, and it took a lot out of me. As much as I, as you said before, you're like a sponge when you travel, and you learn about these things, and you talk to people, but I learned so much, and I met so many amazing people through it. So it is something it's hard to let go of, because it's been such an integral part of my life for the past 4 years. And it was an amazing thing to work on. But I think that every good thing comes to an end, right? And I feel like if you keep pressing something, and I don't want to force it. To simplify that, is like, I don't want to force myself to expand on it, because I feel like me personally, I've kind of pushed it to the point where I'm like, okay, I think I'm pretty happy with the outcome, and I'm pretty happy with how the work's turned out, and I'm pretty happy with the feedback that I've received from it, and I feel like I have contributed to that conversation.